You're probably trying to push yourself harder right now. Maybe it's in business, maybe it's fitness, maybe it's just getting up early and staying consistent. And yet, you keep hitting this invisible wall. You tell yourself to try harder, to focus, to stop being lazy. But the more pressure you apply, the worse it gets. Motivation dries up. Execution becomes friction, and your mind, despite all your willpower, starts looking for a way out. If that sounds familiar, let's get one thing clear. This isn't a character flaw. It's a system flaw. You're trying to control a high-performance engine using brute force when what it really needs is calibration. Here's the paradox. The more tightly you try to control your own behavior, the more resistance you create inside your nervous system. That resistance isn't random. It's a direct result of how your brain interprets control. When you say, "I have to do this," your brain hears threat, not opportunity, not freedom, not growth, just pressure. And the response to pressure, biologically, is stress. The moment your brain shifts into stress, it activates the survival network. This includes your amygdala and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, regions that specialize in detecting danger, not driving discipline. So instead of entering a state of flow, you enter a state of defense. You become reactive, over-analytical, and, ironically, less capable of executing on the very thing you're trying to force. That's why some of the most ambitious people burn out not from overwork, but from overcontrol. They grip so tightly to the idea of discipline that they choke their own performance. And this isn't just a philosophical idea, it's testable. In behavioral neuroscience, there's a phenomenon known as ego depletion. But the newer data suggests something deeper. What really depletes you isn't the task itself. It's the constant internal conflict that happens when your logical brain fights your emotional brain for control. That internal battle burns cognitive energy. It splits focus. It introduces hesitation in decisions that should be automatic. So your system slows down. Execution becomes fragmented. Momentum dies. Here's where it gets tactical. The goal isn't to remove discipline, it's to replace tension-based control with clarity-based guidance. You don't need more pressure, you need better leverage. Because when you understand how to work with your neurobiology instead of against it, you stop burning energy on resistance and start channeling it into precision. That's where this video begins. You're about to learn a completely different way to drive consistent, powerful action without triggering the internal resistance loop. This is not motivation. It's not hustle. It's not discipline as you've been taught. This is a control override protocol built on real neuroscience. And it starts with understanding one thing. The way you talk to yourself is either a trigger or a key. So let's break this down into an actual system. If pressure creates resistance, then your first move is to shift from command mode to calibration mode. And that begins with a question. Not how do I force myself to do this, but what conditions allow this to happen with the least friction? This is called the Environment Alignment Protocol. It's used by elite performers across industries, and it flips the entire discipline conversation on its head. Instead of trying to control your behavior from the inside out, you control your environment from the outside in. And here's the science behind it. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, is sensitive to context. This means that the cues around you literally change how you think. Not metaphorically, biologically. Studies from Stanford, MIT, and the Max Planck Institute all confirm one thing. Environmental friction reduces cognitive precision. That's a fancy way of saying, if your workspace is chaotic, if your phone is vibrating, if your to-do list is a wall of noise, your brain is already burning energy before you've done anything meaningful. And once that energy reserve starts dropping, your discipline follows. That's why your first code here is surgical simplicity. Before you demand action from yourself, you remove decisions. One step, one surface, one target. That's it. You don't try to conquer the day. You engineer a corridor, one narrow path where every option is either aligned or eliminated. Think of it like this. Discipline isn't about fighting distractions. It's about designing a space where distractions can't exist. The fewer negotiations you have with your environment, the faster your brain locks in. And once you're in, focus doesn't feel like effort. It feels like gravity. Now here's your exact execution sequence. First, isolate the trigger zone. That's the physical location where the action needs to happen. It might be your desk, a corner of a room, a specific chair. Second, eliminate visual noise, clear it down to the essentials. One tool, one interface, one open tab. Third, assign a ritual to enter. That could be as simple as putting on noise-canceling headphones or opening a blank document. The point is to create a consistent sensory anchor that tells your brain we're about to execute. These are not hacks. This is neuroarchitecture. You're building a space where performance happens by default, not by demand. And yes, this also applies to digital environments. If your phone is a chaos portal, you remove all non-essential apps from your home screen. If your browser is a temptation factory, you use a single workspace window with a predetermined set of tabs. You're not trying to fight willpower fatigue. You're eliminating the friction that causes it. That's the first layer of the protocol. Alignment before execution. Design before discipline. When you stop treating discipline as a battle and start treating it as a blueprint, your output changes instantly. You stop dragging your mind like a weight, you start guiding it like a current. But let's take it deeper. Because even with a perfect environment, your internal resistance can still sabotage the moment. That's where we enter layer 2 of the override protocol, shifting from willpower to identity coherence. The science is clear. Your brain doesn't just respond to goals. It responds to internal models. In other words, how you see yourself directly influences what your nervous system allows you to do. This is why two people with the same strategy can get radically different results. One is aligned. The other is misfiring from the inside out. Here's how that works in real time. When you say, "I need to be more disciplined," your brain treats that statement as a contradiction. Because if you needed to be more of something, it assumes you're not already that. That subtle gap between who you think you are and what you're trying to do becomes friction. You might not feel it consciously, but neurologically, it creates dissonance. Your prefrontal cortex is trying to act, but your limbic system, the emotional driver, is saying, "This doesn't match the current operating model," so it resists, not to hurt you, but to maintain coherence. Now here's the tactical pivot. You don't force new behaviors into an old identity. You upgrade the identity first. That's the second code. You install an internal model that reflects who you're becoming, not just what you're doing. And this isn't vague affirmation nonsense. This is precision recalibration. Here's how you do it. You begin with a phrase, not to impress yourself, but to instruct your nervous system. That phrase is this: "This is what I do now." Not someday, not if everything aligns right now. You anchor the behavior into identity. For example, when you sit down to write, don't say, "I hope I stay focused." Say, "This is what focused people do, and I'm already in motion." When you go to the gym, you're not trying to become consistent. You're enacting the identity of someone who doesn't negotiate with that decision. This might sound subtle, but it changes everything. Because once your nervous system perceives a behavior as congruent with your identity, it stops resisting. It cooperates. You shift from internal friction to internal fluency. And here's the field evidence. Elite performers don't spend energy on "should I?" They build their identity architecture in advance. So when execution time hits, the system is already aligned. You want to do the same. So here's your implementation protocol. Choose one action you've been resisting, then define the identity it reflects at its highest level. For example, writing is the action, communicator is the identity, training is the action, disciplined builder is the identity. Once that's locked, you pair it with a directive. This is what I do now. You don't wait for alignment. You assert it. You stop sending mixed messages to your nervous system, and instead you install one clear directive that eliminates hesitation. You're not acting. You're expressing who you already are. That's identity coherence. And it's one of the most powerful upgrades in performance psychology. Now let's talk about the moment that kills momentum more than anything else. Hesitation. That micro delay between intent and action. You think about starting, you feel the spark, but instead of moving, you pause. And that pause becomes paralysis. This isn't a mindset issue, it's a timing issue. Because your nervous system operates on a rhythm, tight windows where energy, focus, and clarity converge. And when you miss that window, your system collapses back into conservation mode. You stop acting, you start analyzing, and the loop resets. That's why the third layer of this override protocol is the zero lag rule. The zero lag rule is simple. It states that the faster you act on a meaningful intention, the less resistance you'll face. It sounds obvious, but here's the neuroscience. When you experience an impulse to act, whether it's starting a workout, sending a pitch, or initiating a hard conversation, your brain lights up in the anterior cingulate cortex. That region is responsible for signaling the need for behavioral change. But here's the catch. That signal decays rapidly. The longer you wait, the weaker the signal becomes. And eventually your default network, the part of your brain that conserves energy, takes back control. That's when the rationalizations kick in. That's when you stall. So what's the solution? You train speed of execution, not intensity, not scale. Speed. You create a direct link between signal and movement. The key isn't to do everything perfectly. The key is to act while the signal is alive. Even a tiny step counts. One click, one sentence, one rep. Because once motion begins, momentum follows. And once momentum takes over, the system stabilizes. Now you're not fighting inertia, you're riding it. Here's the protocol you install. You set a micro threshold, something so small that there's no room for debate. For example, open the document, not write the chapter. Put on your shoes, not run 5 kilometers. Say the first line, not deliver the whole presentation. The moment you feel hesitation, you drop into that micro action immediately. That's your ignition switch. Your goal isn't to complete the task. It's to cross the activation barrier, and that changes everything. Because when your nervous system gets used to acting without lag, you retrain your response pattern. Action becomes the default. Hesitation becomes the exception. And this applies across domains: sales calls, cold outreach, creative flow, fitness. The most effective people don't feel less fear. They just move before the resistance fully forms. And that single behavior, rapid activation, becomes their competitive edge. So here's the drill. For the next 3 days, every time you notice that pause where you say, I should, but don't, you immediately execute the smallest version of the intended action. Track it, train it, build the link. Because when you remove lag time, you remove the gap where excuses are born. You're no longer trying to convince yourself. You're moving faster than doubt. And that's how you stay ahead of resistance before it ever gets a chance to speak. Now, we bring it all together. You've shifted from control to calibration, from pressure to leverage, from resistance to rhythm. You're no longer trying to dominate your own mind through force. You're upgrading the operating system through precision. That's what elite performance really is. It's not the absence of struggle. It's the presence of systems that remove unnecessary conflict. And at the core of this shift is one idea. Discipline is not an act of suppression. It's a state of alignment. When your environment supports the behavior, when your identity matches the action, and when your initiation happens without delay, you stop fighting yourself. You move forward without friction. That's the real flex. Not just grinding harder, but engineering a state where forward motion becomes your default. No internal argument, no push-pull, just clarity in action. And here's what's wild. Once this protocol is installed, your nervous system starts to trust you. That's not motivational fluff. That's neuroplasticity in action. Every time you follow through without resistance, your brain rewires. You reinforce a new self-image, one where action isn't a question, it's a pattern, and that pattern compounds. Suddenly, what used to drain you becomes automatic. What felt like discipline becomes normal. And that's when performance becomes scalable, because it's not built on force, it's built on fluency. So now ask yourself, are you trying to control your way through resistance, or are you engineering a system that makes resistance irrelevant? That's the paradox of willpower. The tighter you grip, the less control you have. But when you shift from force to alignment, your output changes permanently. You don't just get more done. You become the kind of person who moves with precision, because the system is clean and the signal is clear. And if you want to keep stacking protocols like this, real, tested, elite-level systems for mental dominance and operational clarity, subscribe to Success Code. This channel isn't motivation. It's not mindset fluff. It's your arsenal for mental advantage in a world built on noise. One code at a time. Let's build your edge.